session, as will other resources from this discussion. And then finally, we request you to exercise discretion on what you post on social media, especially attribution of comments to specific individuals. We are discussing very sensitive issues today, so we hope that you'll be respectful of the space that we're trying to create here. And then a last point, which is if for any reason you exit the meeting or technology gives way and the hosts get kicked out of the meeting, please log in again using the original details that were provided to you as part of the meeting invite. So with that, let me turn to our speakers. We have an exciting lineup, as I said before, and this will be followed by smaller group discussions where we hope to hear from most of you who have joined us too. So first, let me turn to my colleague, Alan Wu from the OGP Support Unit, Senior Regional Coordinator for Asia Pacific, for a few initial observations of what we're seeing in OGP and to propose a few ways in which OGP can be used to protect and expand participation in civic space. Over to you, Alan.
Good afternoon. Hi, my name is Alan Wu. I'm the Senior Regional Coordinator for Asia Pacific at the Open Government Partnership. This presentation will aim to provide a very brief overview of the challenges to inclusive participation and civic space associated with the pandemic and suggest some short and longer term responses highlighting how OGP can be used to assist these efforts. So can we just bring up the, skip forward. Yes, the next one after that. All right, so the 2019 OGP Global Report showed that OGP members were not immune to the global decline in civil liberties. Most OGP countries were already seeing a deterioration in civil liberties between 2011 and 2018, prior to the pandemic. Next. Of course, the deterioration has now been compounded by emergency measures adopted in response to the coronavirus. Here are some regional statistics demonstrating more recent deterioration across partnership countries in the region. Compared to other regions, we're seeing more restrictions in media freedoms and freedom of expression, including online, and lower rates of publication and testing data. Let's now consider why and how we can protect and enhance public participation, inclusion, and civic space throughout the pandemic response. In the context of the pandemic, continued public participation in government decision-making, whether in policy development, program delivery, or monitoring and evaluation, is vital. It helps ensure that governments uphold the rule of law during a vulnerable time, and that significant and costly interventions, whether they're new stimulus packages, broadened social safety nets, or strengthened public health measures, are best positioned to fulfill their policy objectives and are responsive to community needs and expectations. In responding to the pandemic, we think it's important that first, governments continue to engage civil society in the development, delivery, and review of coronavirus interventions. For example, in Kenya, a Senate committee methodically invited public submissions in the process of drafting their pandemic response and management bill. Public engagement and oversight of legislative and executive functions should also continue. In New Zealand, for example, their ombudsman has issued guidance aiming to preserve access to official information throughout the pandemic. And lastly, where restrictions on public participation are absolutely necessary, they should be clear, justified, and time limited. In an emergency, it can be really easy for inclusion efforts to fall by the wayside, but marginalized communities are disproportionately affected by many of the health and economic hardships brought about by the pandemic. In responding to the pandemic, it's important that first, governments engage, understand, report, and respond to the special impacts of the pandemic and emergency measures on vulnerable communities, for example, including in relation to gender-based violence, homeschooling, elder care, home care, and those participating in the informal economy. Intersectional data should be collected and analysed. Here, for example, the French government will pay for 20,000 hotel nights for victims of domestic abuse and will create pop-up counselling locations at shopping centres to make that assistance more accessible. Where processes are moved online, consideration should be given to ensuring broad and inclusive access. Lastly, many of the pandemic interventions, such as social distancing, contact tracing, and quarantine, have had unintended and negative impacts on civic space. In many cases, these have been used to justify disproportionate restrictions. Many civil society organizations are no longer able to conduct even basic functions, meeting, fundraising, lobbying, and demonstrating, that limits their scope to help shape, contribute to, and monitor government activity at a time when it is most needed. In responding to the pandemic, it's important that first, where restrictions on freedom of assembly or association are imposed, they should be clearly prescribed in law, necessary for the protection of public health and non-discriminatory. These measures should be open to administrative review and automatically sunset. For example, in Germany, the Constitutional Court has ruled that health concerns do not provide sufficient grounds for a general ban on demonstrations. This is especially true in relation to the extraordinary collection, retention, and use of sensitive personal data, including medical, travel, and contact records. And in this case, for example, Mexico has created a dedicated website about the privacy protections that apply during the pandemic, with information for both those from whom data is collected and those who do the collecting. Lastly, though shortfalls in funding are likely temporary, they have also been so significant for CSOs that many now face the prospect of insolvency. Accordingly, governments should consider temporarily making their funding streams more flexible, for example, by easing restrictions on the purposes to which government funding may be applied. And in this case, for example, in Tunisia, they've pledged to provide public funding for independent media outlets to enable them to continue operating throughout the pandemic. So of course, OGP can be used to help and support these efforts. We can do this in several ways. In the short term, OGP multi-stakeholder forums can be used to discuss and agree upon open response measures. And in the longer term, the co-creation process used to develop action plans can be used to safeguard civil society's equal seat at the table. Second, countries can make open government commitments to protect the public's ability to associate, assemble, and express itself. And obviously, these can address broader civic space issues beyond those that have arisen during the pandemic. Lastly, the platform can be used to discuss concerns within the OGP community of reformers in other global fora and to identify and leverage the support of partners to support reforms. OGP and our partners have developed quite a wealth of material relating to the issues that I've covered today, of which my presentation has been a very brief distillation. We'll provide these links to these resources in follow-up communication to this webinar. Our partners, of course, are also ready and able to provide technical support in policy development and implementation. But for now, that's all from me. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Alan, for that brief overview of what we are hearing from the community in terms of the challenges and restrictions that civil society and citizens more broadly are facing in the region, but also some positive examples from beyond the region in terms of what actions could look like that could expand and protect space rather than closing them down, even under these difficult circumstances. So we deliberately focused on a few examples from beyond the region. We're counting on all of you to use the chat box to tell us about good practices in civic participation, in inclusion, in protection of civic space. Through the chat box, we'll collect these and make sure that we add these to the crowdsourced examples we are collecting as part of the open response, open recovery effort. We're also joined by too many OGP support unit colleagues to name for now, but they are available to answer any questions you have for the OGP support unit and the IRM. So keep those coming for us through the chat box, but also for speakers as we go through the lineup. So with that, let me next turn to a government voice. Let's turn to Eugene Lee, government point of contact for South Korea. South Korea, of course, is currently co-chair of OGP, and they will soon assume the lead chair role later this year. Eugene, it's easy to forget that South Korea, which has been recognized more recently for its handling of the pandemic on many fronts, not too long ago had more than 1 million citizens in the streets protesting for change. So perhaps can you share your thoughts on why investing in protecting and expanding space and participation is a good investment for governments? How has the Moon administration's approach to dealing with dissent been? But also how you're looking at these issues as the incoming lead chair of the partnership, with the ability to set an agenda for the next 10 years of OGP. So over to you, Eugene.
Thank you, Sharia. I'd like to start by saying thank you for having me today. It is my great pleasure to speak at the webinar on behalf of the government of Korea. I think civic space discussion has come at the right time when it becomes more difficult to keep the same level of engagement since the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic. I have to say, however, that we are finding new ways to collaborate by going digital or taking it slow to some extent rather than stopping the co-creation process. It's been also widely demonstrated that being inclusive and participatory is a good way to respond to unprecedented challenges like the COVID-19 pandemic.
Eugene, if I could ask you to be slightly louder, please. I think the audio is a bit weak, so just a bit louder if you can, please.
Can you hear me better now?
Better, yeah.
Okay. So as Shreya explained, Korea as incoming co-chair of OGP is currently working on priority areas, and one of them is to strengthen national, regional, and global efforts to expand civic space. Korea with civil society co-chair Maria Baron is willing to support member countries to uphold basic freedoms of speech, assembly, and association. At the national level, I'd like to share some of our experience in responding to the pandemic, guided by the fundamental values, the principles of being transparent, accountable, and responsive to citizens. Since we found the first case in January, we have taken measures of testing, contact tracing, and quarantine to flatten the curve and recover. What made our responses stronger is to partner with civil society and citizens. One example of our collaboration is a mask app. It's an app that shows how many masks are available in pharmacies of your neighborhood. It all started with a problem, a long crowded queue in front of the pharmacies. With the possibility of further spread, we had to do something that protects people from infection. So what happened is that we created a space where civil society can use public data of mask supplies to make an app that solves a problem. We also have similar cases with a doctor suggesting a drive-through testing station and a college student making an online platform for updates. Of course, advanced technological infrastructure helps, but we might have not made full use of them without genuine collaboration with civil society. And I should not forget to mention that citizens' voluntary collective action has been a great help as well throughout the whole process. We had national elections in May, the first after the pandemic, and it turned out to be the highest rate of votes in nearly 30 years. So I think in a way that it represents that civic space does not have to be at risk even in times of crisis. And I also like to point out, as our colleague Ellen pointed out, that Open Government Partnership has been an accountable platform. OGP supports, OGP not only crowdsourced open government initiatives and provided learning materials, but also supports member countries to create a multi-stakeholder forum for ongoing dialogue, which I think is a great way to expand civic space, and also to design, implement, and evaluate biennial action plans in partnership with civil society. We have some concerns that we see some parts of the world going in a direction that is far from being open. However, this crisis should never lead us to shrink civic space or act contrary to open government values and principles. So I must say that Korea recognized again the importance of transparency and citizen participation in times of crisis. At the forefront of OGP's work as co-chair, Korea will continuously pursue open government to put citizen participation at the heart of policymaking and lead by example. So I hope today's webinar helps us explore how open government can be used to fight the global challenge collectively. Thank you.
Thanks, Eugene, for those comments. I think good reminders of the trust dividend that can be reaped by governments by continuing to tap into civic energy, civic participation, even in times like this. But also an important reminder of the obligation of OGP countries to really role model and not be reflected in the kinds of statistics that Alan shared earlier. Of course, we recognize that many of you on the webinar today, regardless of whether you're coming from civil society, government, or any other, representing any other stakeholder group. You all have an interest and a stake in this issue and are doing your best to protect these freedoms. So please keep those ideas of how you're doing so coming, but also what needs and challenges you're experiencing in being at the front lines of this very important agenda. So please keep that coming through the chat box. For now, I will turn to our next speaker, Mariati Abdullah, Director of Publish What You Pay Indonesia and OGP Envoy. Mariati, what kind of civic space or participation restrictions and challenges are you seeing in Indonesia? I mean, we heard a very positive opening of what it could look like in South Korea. What's the situation like in Indonesia? But importantly, how is Indonesian civil society responding to this when it comes to mobilizing, organizing, monitoring, and playing that role of keeping the government accountable? And finally, because I know this has been important to the agenda of Publish What You Pay globally and also in Indonesia, how are you approaching issues around engagement of indigenous peoples, gender groups that have been so central to the extractives openness agenda you've been working on? So over to you, Mariati.
Okay, thank you, Sharia, and also have a nice day, everyone. I wanted to highlight also the very important point on protecting civic space is our common responsibility, not just from civil society, but also from the government, because we have our legacy to more provide space and also engagement through this OGP platform and all other platform of democracy. And I think what civil society do based on my observations, not just in the group of Publish What You Pay Indonesia or Extractive and Natural Resource Group, I see there are in one side I see a positive signs, but in other side I also see the challenges in terms of the Indonesian in the Indonesian context. As we know, many group of civil society, like from the protesting group or also from the watchdog group, they get the challenges regarding the digital safety and also security. But in other side, the group of open government partnership and also gender and indigenous people, we have a space to engage in through the OGP platform, like we continuing to engage on the development of national action plan, and also we discuss on open contract, beneficial ownership disclosure as part of the anti-corruption group. And also I see the other group, they have also a very specific issue to monitor the budget in terms of the COVID-19 pandemic, which is a very a good example of the citizen engagement to the policy. And I wanted to emphasize also in terms of the indigenous people and the grassroots group, where they continue also to trying to have to existing in the time of very difficult crisis. But also we have a hand in hand on networking, for example, how to distribute the food and some of the production from the agriculture and other in terms of helping other group of people, not just in urban area, but also in the rural area. This is a very good example. And some group also, we still continuing, particularly after the 2 or 3 months of working from home with the very challenging physical meet chance and others. And also some of the civil society also, we get the kind of the protest. For example, in the parliament office, it's something that not cannot be avoided because of the potential legislation process that not very included civil society participation in one case, like on the legislation related to the investment and other kind. But I see this is like the situation that we need to dealing together, not just from civil society, but also for the government, how this OGP platform can be maximized the civic space, because this related to the effective governments and also effective public policy decision-making process. And the third one, I think for the future, for the recovery post-pandemic era, the civic space, the democracy, and also freedom of press, that's very important. and also the freedom of academization, like expert in a university, that we also get the challenges in Indonesia because many public policy that civil society need to get the monitoring and also get insight in this case. Thank you.
Thanks, Mariotti. I think a few important points there about the power of networks to be able to reach vulnerable groups at this time, and the role of both government and civil society collaborating there. But also a really mixed bag in terms of, there are certain legislative processes which continue to engage civil society and citizens, and yet others that don't, right? So it shows that even within the same context, you're seeing a disconnect of practices, both messages of hope, but also messages that are quite clearly indicative of warning signs. So what can we learn from those positive experiences, and how can we use those to influence instances where we don't see those good practices being upheld? I'm curious to hear from those participating in the webinar if you have any follow-up questions for Mariotti and Eugene, but also perhaps for you to come in on saying, to say how you are approaching this in OGP multi-stakeholder fora in your countries, or for those of you who are joining from non-participating countries, what kind of platforms exist for government and civil society deliberation and dialogue at this point to think about issues around civic space and participation? Or if they don't, tell us that as well. In the meantime, I'll move on to our next speaker. We heard from Mariotti the importance of press freedom. She made a passing reference to it. We know that this is an issue in the region from the stats Alan presented earlier. Media freedoms are being curbed in Asia Pacific at a rate that's much higher than other regions. Perhaps not news to many on this call, but worrying nonetheless. I'll turn to Carol Ilagan, senior content producer from the Philippine Center for Investigative Journalism. Carol, we've seen some of the most successful open government reforms in OGP come from the Philippines, stemming from extremely strong government and civil society partnership. And at the same time, the Philippines, like several others in the region, has been, front and center of the headlines for issues around media freedom and restrictions to freedom of expression. So can you tell us a little bit more about, what the situation is, how media and civil society are approaching their work in light of the challenges you face, but also perhaps, extrapolate to share some lessons learned on how media, whether it's in the Philippines or elsewhere in the region, can continue to operate safely in this situation, and how you strike this balance between constructive collaborators and accountability, holders of that accountability function as well. So Carol, over to you.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Greetings from Manila. I hope you are all well. Thank you, Shreya, and thank you to the Open Government Partnership for this opportunity. We are very grateful to be able to share our experience, but also at the same time learn from what other countries are experiencing as well. So let me give a quick overview of our story so far in the Philippines from the perspective of a media nonprofit. The COVID-19 crisis has offered a good ground for government overreach. As in other countries, governments have been using the pandemic as an opportunity and even a justification to infringe on rights. The Philippines is no stranger to this phenomenon. If I were to describe our experience from the last 3 months since the pandemic broke out, is that the pandemic has threatened truth-telling in the Philippines. We are facing both old and new challenges as spaces for the very same freedoms that we journalists share with citizens, like freedom of expression, freedom of information, have been further restricted during this health crisis. The restrictive measures come in the form of legal provisions, among others. The Anti-Terrorism Act, which was signed by President Duterte last week, is the latest in a series of power grabs, and in this case, using national security as a pretext. Of course, I can't go into detail as to how this particular law was created, but precisely it has to do with the Philippines and its efforts to improve our status because we are being considered as a risky jurisdiction for money laundering, terrorism financing, and financing the narcotics trade. But essentially what legal experts have been saying is that the overbroadness of the law is a serious threat to Filipino democracy, because if you interpret the law liberally, it may turn anyone into a terrorist. And we've seen similar, similar legal provisions in laws in different countries, like in Hong Kong with their national security law. The law also provides for warrantless arrest and court-ordered surveillance. Apart from that, along with the human toll of the COVID-19 crisis, there's also a deadly blow to a number of news outlets in the Philippines. We're probably familiar with the case of Rappler and also the situation of ABS-CBN now. ABS-CBN is the largest media network in the Philippines, and it had to shut down because Congress failed to renew its franchise. From ABS-CBN, which is a big corporation, we also go to community papers. According to the Philippine Press Institute, about half of the organization's members, mostly family-owned community papers, have ceased printing due to economic losses caused by the lockdown. So I think 2 days ago, I just heard of another community paper in Mindanao, I think one of the oldest, if not the oldest, newspaper in Mindanao closing down because of, again, economic losses. So in summary, reporters and newsrooms in the Philippines are under intense pressure, be it financial, physical, and psychological, and during the pandemic, which is arguably one of the most important and complex stories of our time. So where do we go from here? I'm coming from the perspective of a journalist working at an investigative nonprofit covering the pandemic, but also has had its good share of attacks from certain individuals and groups. What I can impart are things that we view as steps in the right direction. And so far, how we've been approaching our work. A lot of reimagining had to be done because this is all unprecedented for all of us. First, I think we all have to get on the same page that measures to address this public health crisis can be more potent if we put human rights front and center. So that includes freedom to speak out, freedom to criticize government and demand government accountability. But this is our problem because our civic space is even narrower now because of the pandemic. At PCIJ, what we try to do is with this limited civic space, as a news organization, we prioritize our resources with the pandemic, telling stories of the most vulnerable, because they're the very same people who are more at risk because of the virus, and also probably the people that government might not be able to hear clearly. So in the past 3 months, we consciously reported on stories on how government policies or how government spends money affect the poorest, women and children, prisoners, and internally displaced people. Collaboration, this was mentioned by Mariati earlier. It has been a buzzword in recent years and for good reason. So in the Philippines, there are a lot of efforts being done by individuals and various organizations in helping track and publish information on COVID-19. FOI has been a casualty in the Philippines with the lockdown, but there's also a deluge of data being put out by government. So there are a lot of individuals, especially from the academe also, who are helping make sense of this data. Second, to my last point, I think it's important this is one lesson for us. Government is not a monolithic entity. So when we talk of the Philippine government, it's not just Duterte. So I think it's important to understand that government is a complex organization. So you have local governments, provincial governments. So it's important to look at where opportunities lie. So not just looking at, national government as just one government. So there are a lot of good examples in the Philippines on how local governments have been responding to COVID-19, such as Pasig City. We also have experience from South Cotabato as well. So I think it's important to get positive developments in these areas and see how others might be influenced. And finally, speaking of open government, I think the public health crisis makes a strong case for the passage of an FOI law in the case of the Philippines, especially at a time when access to information and seeking accountability is most crucial. The stakes have never been higher. So that's all for me now. Thank you very much. Looking forward to our breakout session.
Thanks, Carol, for that very sobering reflection of the situation for investigative journalists in particular, not just in the Philippines but elsewhere in the region. You'll see through the comments what you were sharing resonated across Vietnam and Malaysia and elsewhere. But I think also some interesting things there about how even the very outlets that might be under scrutiny and attack can still continue to collaborate and find allies and keep up the work, using the fact that there is this unprecedented disclosure of data that's also happening at the same time, using that very data to ask important questions and write important stories. So the basis is not one that is just on, opinion or one that can be easily classified on to misinformation, but one that really comes from government data and government policy itself. So important reminders there. It's interesting because, while we've all been saying that this has been, and this is an important issue, one of the things that we observe is many of the agencies that would be crucial to get conversations around media freedoms or civic space are missing from the OGP conversation. So I think if there's one message we can take from the speakers who've spoken for now is for all of us to assess that if this conversation really has to be tackled in any kind of meaningful way in the national OGP discussions, who are the agencies, who are the actors that could be allies that are missing from those conversations, and which are the agencies that might not be quite allies yet, but need those advocacy strategies to bring them on board, even if it's a long and hard journey over time. I think for too long, we've acknowledged that these are issues that exist in OGP countries, but perhaps everyone on the call here can think about how we can meaningfully start to go beyond the acknowledgement of the issue and find those areas for collaboration that Carol spoke to. I have to mention that, we see a few parents, grandparents on the call with kids. This is an important reminder of who this is for. This is an important topic, not just for all of us here, but for the next generation in this region, but also a warm reminder of the realities we're all facing. So again, a big thank you to all participants who've joined us, through, their personal responsibilities as well. Let's remind ourselves again, this is not just for this generation, but for the generation to come. So quick shout out to all of you for joining under these situations. But let me move next to our next speaker, Turod Lakfajav, who's an OGP steering committee member and also, a founder of TI Mongolia. Turod, you saw in the chat comments, and something that we've also seen in Mongolia, the use of NGO laws as an instrument for restrictions of civic space. We are seeing this happen in Afghanistan. We are seeing this happen in Kyrgyzstan. There have been recent attempts in Mongolia as well. So could you talk to us a little bit about what some of these current developments are that you're seeing in Mongolia? But importantly, how is civil society organizing and pushing back against these measures? And how you've used the recent election campaign period, for example, to raise awareness and support for civic space issues. And perhaps if you could also speak to, who is missing from these dialogues that we need to start reaching to, so that, this doesn't just become a question of us preaching to the choir, but we really start to bring in those actors that are crucial for us to get progress on these issues. So over to you, Turod.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. Good afternoon, dear friends and colleagues. So Shreya, I think you raised, I think, not a couple, more than a couple, I think, very important, I think, points, which actually is testing, and I think would test us also in coming months, if not years, whether the OGP can, especially the member countries, and by that I mean both the government and the civil society actors, whether we can practice what we preach, And I think the recent developments, I think both in Mongolia and then also in Kyrgyzstan, and as you also mentioned in Afghanistan, shows how fragile is the state of, let's say, open government in the member countries, especially in the situation of the COVID. So let me first start with quickly on the use of the NPO or NGO laws, to curtail the civic space and the citizen participation. So as some of you may know, in our region, I mean, I would extend the Asia Pacific also to, let's say, larger Eurasia region, if we include Kyrgyzstan. The Russia first adopted what they call a foreign agency laws, and by that restricting especially not only limiting the activities of the non-profit organization, but more importantly, the access to resources. So that has been attempt also in Mongolia also for the last 2 years. And also what has happened most recently in Kyrgyzstan. So they, I think, approved the law which in a way demands more, let's say, stringent reporting if the NGOs or non-profit organizations receive, let's say, foreign resources, but also with regard to the COVID-19, there was a very dangerous trend related to that, you know, to restricting not just the space itself, but also the voice itself, you know. A draft law on the in Kyrgyzstan on the manipulation of the data information, you know, and that would basically mainly apply it against, let's say, the citizen and the civic groups. So what are the? I think everyone knows the challenges, the issues, what we are facing for. So what are, I think, the let's say the ways forward for us, you know, how we can go, let's say, forward on that. I think, and that's actually coming from the practice also in Mongolia, you know. So we, our civil society organized in the 3, let's say, thematic areas. One is, of course, how do we defend the freedom of expression and access to information during this COVID, let's say, 19 crisis situation and the restrictions imposed by the governments, you know, especially in Mongolia. We had our parliament approved a special law on the COVID-19. So for that, we let's say, lobbied our MPs that time, and at least made sure that there is a general, let's say, principle, you know, that every the government operation should be transparent and accountable. So by using that section, we were able, let's say, to review, let's say, some corrupt practices in the public procurement, especially in the health sector, in the Ministry of Health, in the State Emergency Commission. So this is one of the, let's say, proactive, let's say, public interest litigation type of work undertaken by the civil society groups here. Second, here we also use the opportunity to focus on the specific sectors, you know, for example, the extractive industries, because notwithstanding with the COVID restrictions, you know, the extractive industries were operating, and of course, the opacity and the, let's say, of the government contracts, you know, especially the government revenues out of the extractives was very much on the agenda. So we used this time also to reveal and work together with the like-minded, both, let's say, civic society groups on the ground, but also international organizations like Energy and EITI to disclose all the contracts and agreements in the mining sector. So from 40 to 400, I think the number speaks itself. And my last point with the, I think what Shreya raised was also, I think, the elections, you know, because I think after South Korea, Mongolia had, yes, at least in the region, I think the general elections. There's more upcoming, like in Sri Lanka, Myanmar, in Kyrgyzstan and other countries in the region. So this is faces, I think, a particular challenge, you know, both with regard to the citizen participation directly in the, let's say, their right to vote, but also how we engage, especially the citizens directly, not just the voting process itself, but in the, let's say, the whole electoral process, you know, whether the citizens can voice out their, let's say, concerns to the ruling governments or parties or not. So with that, just very quickly, I think what we were able to do is to work together with all the major parties. We had formed a special civil society coalition for fair and free elections. We put up especially the youth mobilization as observers. So notwithstanding with the COVID restrictions, I think that have worked. But even more, I think we used this opportunity also to come together, you know, more or less spontaneously to work on our own, you know, to get a let's say both online but also face to face, you know, within the limited space, work on the putting together first the national concept on the government and civil society partnership in Mongolia, and second on our own draft law on NGOs. So that's, I mean, in a nutshell. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Turod. I mean, I think there are important points you raised. There are a number of countries that we, as you said rightly, will be going into elections in the coming months. We do have experiences from South Korea, now Mongolia, a few others in the region, but also elsewhere. And perhaps there is something for us to do here in terms of creating that platform for peer exchange, not just on the physical security, you know, of the processes as they unfold in very unusual times, but also around how, you know, the basics of participation, the basics of civic freedoms can be, you know, protected as at best during, you know, perhaps what's the most important political process any citizen can participate in. But there were also interesting reflections you had on how civil society, when they work in unison, can work together in ensuring that provisions for some of these laws that are getting passed have in them clauses that allow for review and accountability. And, you know, as several of the guides that we put together with the collaboration of many of the partners on this call suggest, most of these measures should ideally come with a very clear clause for sunset. So when restrictions that are necessary for public health should be lifted, and keeping those just proportionate. So a few things that I think that we'll take away in terms of, you know, future exchanges, you know, as countries go through elections, but also, you know, are navigating this process of NGO laws being introduced in countries. In several countries, we are at that stage where they're still being deliberated, they're not passed yet. So there is a window of opportunity, and we would invite our Mongolian civil society colleagues, you know, Turod and others, to share, you know, your tactics and strategies in much more detail so that others can benefit from that experience. There's a very tough question from one of our participants, Sherwin, and I'll ask if any of our speakers want to come in on this, which is that, you know, we're seeing that, you know, there's a securitized, militarized approach that's being used in many countries in dealing with COVID-19. So we're seeing the deployment of military forces, police forces. What are some of the open government practices that can be adopted in these situations where you're seeing this kind of securitized response? So I don't know if anyone wants to jump in from our speakers. You know, one of our final speakers, Raman, is also here. So, you know, Raman, do feel free to come in as well. And for anyone else who has ideas, please share them through the chat box. This is a not so easy question, let's say, but I'll see if any of our speakers want to come in on this.
Hi, Shreya.
Go for it.
Hi, thank you, Sherwin, for the question. That's actually a very difficult question. Of course, coming from the Philippines, I get what you pointed out, securitized, militarized. I would also say the approach of the national government has been punitive in terms of dealing with COVID-19, because there have been a lot of arrests for quarantine violation in the Philippines. So imagine if they go to prison and, you know, they go to detention centers, there's more chance for them to get infected. This is speaking in ideal terms, of course. But of course, when we say open government, we talk about people being part of the decision-making process. So perhaps, I mean, you know, on top of my head is, of course, I wonder whether there are opportunities for people, civil society, to participate in terms of what the government is going to do to respond to the COVID-19 crisis. So, like, for example, the Philippines passed a law that gave the president emergency powers, but I wonder how, you know, how the implementation of that law will be done or not just that particular law, but for example, the interagency task force that's responsible for responding to COVID-19, whether there are interactions with civil society or other groups as to how this particular task force is going to respond to to COVID-19. So, I mean, I didn't really offer any, it's a difficult question. But again, if we're talking of open government, ideally, I would hope that civil society is part of that conversation as well.
Thanks, Carol. Would anyone else like to comment on this?
If I might just quickly provide some reflections. I mean, I think if there are genuine restrictions on human rights, then there is a established test in human rights law around when those restrictions might be applied. So we talked about them a bit earlier around being prescribed by law, pursuant to a legitimate aim, in this case, probably public health, and genuinely necessary rather than merely administratively convenient. So depending on the national system, you might have a claim, a justiciable claim in the local courts on that basis. I think more broadly, there's also the case to be made that we should, as civil society organizations, there's a consideration about how you want to frame the issue in the pandemic. I think a lot of governments have used framings around war and battle, around disasters, talking about how we'll fight against the virus, frontline staff, battle against COVID-19, a tidal wave, like going lockdown, bunker. Like it's a very sort of harsh and type of language, I think, which necessitates a certain response. And I think the alternative, the most obvious one to me, is to instead use language around journeys and navigation and challenges. So talking about how we overcome the hurdles in our way, making sure that no one's left behind, we're on the same boat together, navigating our way through and out this crisis. And I think that shift in language changes the way that the public understands and conceives of the challenges in front of us, and also the most obvious responses, so less sort of militarized and securitized, and more health and social safety net focused.
Thanks for that, Alan. And there are a range of measures around the transparency and accountability of justice sector institutions. We will have some forthcoming publications on this that we'd be happy to share. I know we have colleagues from NAMATI and other organizations as well, so feel free to come in and tell us about how these institutions that are often deployed in the name of public health can be still kept transparent and accountable, but also important reminders, I think, thanks for that, Alan, on the language and terminology and how that might inadvertently promote certain measures that are perhaps, we can all agree, disproportionate in many contexts. And of course, then we do have some examples from the region where we are seeing the army being deployed only to a very limited extent, as Ken has pointed on chat, for medical corps, for assisting with compliance and quarantine. So there are good ways in which these forces can be deployed, and then there are ways in which they can be deployed to crack down on civic space and restrictions. So thank you very much to all our speakers. We now have a very complex operation at hand, which is to get 112 people into breakout groups. So bear with us and the technology. Ivy, my colleague Ivy, is going to make sure we are shepherded into separate groups. Anouk, if you could just have the slide up with the discussion prompts. We will have half an hour in this space. This is a time when we want to hear from many of you. It's hard to do this with 112 people in plenary. We hope in the breakouts you will share your experiences, in interesting resources you've come across, but also what needs, challenges, and opportunities you see for OGP as a platform to deliver on domestically, regionally, and globally in the coming months. We will come back to hear from our final speaker, Raman Chima from Access Now, who will talk us through tackling digital security and privacy threats that we're seeing at this time. Time is always short, and there's always that dilemma, whether we keep you here with us for 3 hours or whether we just hope that all of you will participate in continuing the discussion after the webinar. But for now, we'll turn to our final speaker for the day. Something that came up in our breakout was this idea of technological solutionism, us being careful of it. The reality remains that many of us are moving towards online spaces for organizing, expressing, meeting, like we are today, but also painfully aware that in many contexts, this very act puts reformers at further risk of surveillance, privacy intrusions, digital security threats. This happens at the best of times, but of course the challenge is further exacerbated when there are suspensions to freedoms and extraordinary powers put in place during times like the one that we are seeing today. So we'll turn now to Raman Chima, Senior International Council and Asia Pacific Policy Director from Access Now. Raman, what are some of the regional trends you're seeing in this regard, and any tips and tricks on how yeah, so Raman, any sort of, just to repeat because there was a microphone muting issue, what are some of the regional trends you're seeing on digital security threats and threats to privacy and freedom of expression online, and tips and tricks for how civil society, but reformers in general, can operate under restricted conditions, protect themselves as they do so, do's and don'ts and any useful resources you have to share. So over to you, Raman. Reminder to unmute yourself.
Perfect. Just to check, can you hear me clearly? Super great. Thanks all for confirming that. So as Shreya mentioned, I work with Access Now. We are an international human rights organization that looks at human rights in the digital age. And I use that term very precisely. In fact, we originally built ourselves as a digital rights organization. And I think what the pandemic has shown a lot of us is that digital is now mainstream. Not to say that everybody is connected with the same opportunity or access or ability to engage as they should. The reality is that nearly every issue that we deal with, from governance to human rights to public participation, now involves digital in some manner, even when it's not well baked. So I would joke and say that all the issues that the digital policy and digital rights people have faced and know the limitation of technology, now you all see on an everyday basis, which is the case. Why I mentioned that is also particularly in the Asia Pacific region, what you've seen is that there have been challenges during COVID that people have faced that have been because they're using more digital means, but also what's happened is that many traditional issues affecting human rights, public participation, as well as governance have now very specifically digital policy or digital law focused overlap and linkage there. Just to, thing that I probably mentioned. So the one thing our organization is well placed to look at is digital security threats to activists and others. We were actually born as a digital security organization. I'm a lawyer and I cover public policy for the Asia Pacific region as well as global cybersecurity policy. But the origin of Access Now was a digital security organization to help activists, journalists, transparency workers, whistleblowers, all the people who speak truth to power to receive digital security help and assistance. And what we have is a digital security helpline, which is again the one asset I can also share with all of you to use. And I'll put the link in chat briefly, but it's a 24/7 helpline that you can contact globally, that if you face any threats to your work, for example, you believe your accounts or services have been compromised or targeted, or you're an organization that works in a high risk environment, or you thought it wasn't high risk, but it now is, you can receive proactive free assistance. And we try and do our best. Again, we don't do this just by ourselves. A lot of the materials you will see on our website or when you reach out to our incident response team are built on the fantastic work by many other organizations globally, but also excellent digital security activists based in this region. We have our own incident response staff that are based out of the Asia Pacific region, primarily out of the Philippines, but elsewhere as well. But we connect with many local helplines. And the one thing we've noticed, which I thought I'd share, is that there's been an increasing, of course, using of digital channels and means to target activists. The shrinking of civic space that you see that is happening generally offline very much is also happening online. And what that means is that targeted attacks of activists or people who may be using digital means, who are receiving physical world harassment, who now worried, say, about their mobile phones being compromised, their messaging systems being impacted, their online storage being targeted by bad actors, sometimes in government, sometimes outside government. And what we saw in April as the pandemic spread across the world and lockdowns were triggered in a large part of this region as well, was that it was the single largest number of requests we have received in a month, and the single largest overall number of cases that our helpline received, but also the single largest increase in any month in our existence in nearly a decade. And that's something remarkable because it also, besides us, we know we only receive a small percentage of what are the actual issues that you might be facing. For example, many of you would not have known of our helpline prior to me talking about it today in this webinar. But that just reflects this number of threats that people are facing. And of course, what that also represents is that as people go online, many of the more traditional tools they use may place them at greater risk. The more secure ICT tools they may have in their office environment may not be easily available to them at home. But also bad actors, whether they be criminals, whether they be people in government trying to repress human rights sometimes, know that people are more vulnerable and more, in a sense, sometimes in a delicate, not resilient situation in terms of how they access their means. What I will do here is post the link to our helpline so you have that accessible. Give me just 1 second. Great. And you can see a variety of tools, and I'll come about that a bit later. But beyond just the digital security situation and response, what I thought is also remarkable is definitely something that many others have spoken about, is the policy and legal developments as well. Unfortunately, across large parts of the Asia-Pacific region, we have seen an increasing trend towards digital authoritarianism, but also the use of laws on cybercrime, laws on cybersecurity, but also fake news and disinformation laws, unfortunately not being always used for their stated purposes. That is to say, prevent cybercrime, ensure better cybersecurity, or prevent targeted disinformation, but instead being used to chill people who governments or those in power may not always be happy with, in violation of, say, commitments to the OGP as well as international human rights standards. So what we did do, along with several other organizations, is we've been publishing regular resources, including during the COVID period, and I'll make that available here as well, which we also saw a significant spike. In the Asia-Pacific region, before the pandemic, we have seen a use of cybercrime and cybersecurity laws in several countries, particularly in South Asia, including Bangladesh, India, with its Information Technology Act, and in Bangladesh's case, moving from its Information Technology Act to its Digital Security Act currently, to more well-known global phenomena, the Cybercrimes Act in Thailand, and prosecution and measures followed there, but also disinformation laws passed in other countries. We've seen them exist pre-pandemic, and what's happened post the pandemic is you've seen those laws continue, sometimes calls to sharpen them, which have been very problematic. But also, I think many people were surprised by is that many historic laws regarding, say, epidemic disease control or, say, public health were also used to target people. For example, the use of Epidemic Diseases Act in many countries to threaten prosecution of journalists or public health activists and whistleblowers who are raising concerns around public health responses by governments. Because as you know, even though governments may always try to do the right and the best thing, that's not often the case. They do make mistakes, sometimes inadvertently or sometimes intentionally. And the role of the community is to reveal those. Unfortunately, people are seeing epidemic diseases laws, for example, being used to target activists and say, you are spreading targeted disinformation. And then we used to harass them. What the COVID-19 situation has also shown many of us is that the traditional means of challenge, for example, many of you talked about courts of law, sometimes other institutions like parliamentary bodies, are often, not always, but often struggling in many parts of the Asia-Pacific region. For example, in our breakout room, we talked a bit briefly about say, public trust in government in, say, Australia and New Zealand versus elsewhere in the region. And what you'll see is in some countries, you had governments that are actively allowing remedy mechanisms, courts and others to function. In other cases, it's very hard to be able to access them. Legislative institutions are not easily allowed to function due to pandemic-related restrictions, for example, in India or elsewhere. Courts are not easy to access, or you face emergency powers that governments have enacted that makes it harder to sometimes bring an action to court. And that's a challenge that this ecosystem is facing. The other trend that I thought I'd mention, which is something a bit related to the digital security threats we see, and I think we need to discuss more in the Asia-Pacific region, is that even prior to the pandemic, we have seen a significant increase in the use of spyware and malware technologies in an organized way to target activists and transparency whistleblowers. For example, whether it's the use of targeted malware to target opposition figures during the Malaysian elections, to the revelations that, for example, Indian police units, whether at the center or state level, have extensively used firms such as NSO, the NSO group based in Israel, whose Pegasus software has been now revealed by groups such as Citizen Lab and others to specifically target whistleblowers and transparency activists in many countries, to even more advanced persistent threats supposedly located in this region. Even more recently, for example, we need to move away from that. There's been discussion on how hacking technologies developed in the West are being used in Asia Pacific. And now you instead see technologies based and developed in this region, homegrown spyware in a sense, being used to target many of the people who we engage with or sometimes who might even be part of these networks. For example, more recently, there was additional revelation that a project called Dark Basin, a hack for hire initiative that was taking place globally, was actually primarily headquartered out of an Indian spyware firm that seemed to be based, in New Delhi, for example. But this sort of targeted malware is a new threat that our communities need to engage with, and we are encouraging more actors to work so that the digital security groups and whistleblowers and transparency groups on the ground are better coordinated. The thing that I'd also probably mention a bit briefly further is that these networks exist. Please make use of them. As I mentioned,
to wrap up within the next minute or so.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's my ending one. So I was going to say that you have existing networks on digital security. Access Now, for example, runs a helpline. It connects with many other groups in the Civic network, the communities of emergency response teams to support civic space, Civic, but also other groups providing free assistance. For example, people mentioned Namati and they do excellent work. So there are groups like Trust Law and others moving beyond digital security to, for example, the data protection or data that many groups in this network may maintain. There are groups out there. Don't hesitate to reach out. But more importantly, tell us how we can better assist and support you. And I'll briefly end with this, that there are existing convenings in the digital rights and digital human rights space that people should engage with. RightsCon is a more famous one that we organize, an annual summit on human rights in the digital age. We moved to an online version later this month, which you can register for right now, and I encourage you to register for it prior to the event. And also other communities exist. The Keep It On network, for example, that tracks internet shutdowns in the Asia Pacific region, and as well as more focused initiatives, for example, such as litigators who work on digital rights, the Digitalized Litigators Network that Access Now and the Media Legal Defense Initiative helped set up. But please reach out, we're happy to help. And more importantly, our helpline is free and open to all to access. So please use it and please tell us how we can be better and how we can better support you. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Raman. I mean, the chilling ways in which we're seeing these threats unfold and in multiple places, I think I won't even try to summarize what you said there, but also for that offer of help. I think a good reminder throughout this discussion that there are many ways in which the OGP platform can be used. Of course, there is the using of the fora itself to discuss the immediate response measures that government and civil society should ideally be doing in partnership right now. Commitments in the action plans as long-term recovery efforts, but also importantly, this is a forum that we can all use to educate ourselves about some of these things. There are many things that you shared, Raman, and others throughout the session that were also new to me. And that kind of knowledge learning, peer exchange fora is also one that I think we could personally sort of, enhance the way in which we use OGP for. And finally, I think an important reminder of the communities that we're not connected to, the transparency and open government movement cannot sit disconnected from communities that work on these issues and somehow magically expect that the agenda will start to address some of these things. So important reminders from you there, Raman, of, much in the tone of the rest of the session. But do, open invitation to all participants and follow-up to keep sharing examples of resources, of support that's available, but also other foreign platform that you think, particularly in this region, it'll be vital for us to connect to in the coming months. We hope this is the start of a dialogue. We are on time, so I'll just invite Ivy to say a few closing words. There will be material shared and follow up, but again, I think an important reminder from Raman on various topics that we could be addressing in future conversations, diving much deeper than we have been able to perhaps on some of these very, very big challenges we face. And just to say that, as we've seen sort of homegrown measures, as Raman mentioned, of ways to curb civic space in this region, I hope that the OGP platform can be used for homegrown solutions to some of these as well. And certainly we invite all of you to reach out for any support and assistance you need. So with that, I'll turn to Ivy Yong, also Senior Regional Coordinator for Asia Pacific, for the final few words.
Cool. Thanks, Shreya. It's been an awesome 95 minutes with everyone, learning so much from all of you, from your country reflections, Carol, Mariati, Turod, Raman, and especially in your small group discussions. So just two quick things to remind you of this rich discussion that we've had. We'll summarize and consolidate and share a blog so that everyone has a copy of what we've learned and what provoked us as well in terms of insights, in terms of lessons, even questions that you might be taking away from this conversation. More importantly, we've shared a link to resources. Raman has shared as well for Access Now. We'll be clubbing that together with the blog and sharing that with everyone who has joined. amazing turnout, even if we've gone over time already. And the last thing I wanted to mention is that if you have any requests for additional support, if you want us to connect you with other partners, please reach out. The OGP support unit is here. And we really hope that all the conversations on challenges, on lessons, would hopefully be a way for us to have that conversation domestically and see how we can make use of the OGP platform to ensure that we continue to protect and expand civic space. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. And thanks again to all our speakers as well.
Thank you, everyone. See you again at the last other chance. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Stay safe.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, again.